guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing my 7 easy tips to help you learn Slovene. Now these tips you can use for any language generally, but I'm going to be focusing on Slovene because that's the language I'm trying to also learn. In the description down below I will include a timeline so you can skip to whichever tip you like. Hopefully one of the tips are suitable for your learning style. For example, if you're a visual learner, auditory learner, hopefully there's a tip for you and I hope you find it helpful. But I will be doing a little bit of a backstory before getting to the tips, so if you don't hear me ramble, you can skip to whichever step you want, which you can find in the timeline. I wanted to mention, when learning the language, one thing that really stood out to me when I first moved here is that this language, everyone sounds like they're having an argument for some reason. It doesn't sound as soft as English does. That's just probably because it's like one of those hard languages. For example, it sounds to me like German, Russian, they all sound the same to me. But it's one of those hard languages where when someone's having a conversation near you, you think they're having an argument. Like for example, my husband, he was speaking to his mother and it sounded like he was having a dispute or something. And I asked him, I go, what was that all about? And he goes, oh, we were just talking about cooking. And I was like, oh, sounded like you're having a fight to me. When I moved, I didn't know the language at all, which is a bit silly moving to a country without knowing the language, but yeah, that was me. And to be honest, I'm not one of those people who really loves to learn languages, although I know 3 languages, which one is English, the other 2 are Punjabi and Hindi, and I learnt them from childhood, so I speak with my grandparents Punjabi and I understand Hindi from watching loads of Bollywood movies. So yeah, I was able to understand and speak those languages, but generally I didn't go in pursuit of learning languages. I'm not that type of person who, you know, wants to speak so many languages. But anyway, that aside, so at first it was fine not knowing the language because the people around me generally knew English, which was my husband, my friends and his family. Some of them knew English apart from the grandparents, which didn't know much English, but I was generally fine not knowing the language. But obviously it's helpful learning the language, which I learnt later on, because generally if I went to the store or anything, I would ask my husband, you know, what's this? And I would generally Google. I'm using generally a lot, but I used to Google if I needed to know something before I went to the store, because I'm one of those organized, over-prepared people. And so I never needed to ask anyone for help. But as time went on, I started to feel a bit isolated, which was the problem when I would go to parties and everyone would speak Slovene, and obviously everyone would speak Slovene, and it would just become like noise to me, and I would sit there not feeling part of the conversation, or that I couldn't contribute to the conversation because obviously I didn't know the language. Or if I wanted to go out by myself, I generally wouldn't be able to understand anyone speaking around me, and I would start to feel like an alien, not knowing the language. So then I put it onto myself, you know, I need motivation to learn the language, and you do need motivation to learn a language, otherwise it becomes like homework, you know, something you don't want to do but you need to do. So that was my main motivation, which is not to feel isolated and lonely, and also to get my independence back, so I didn't have to, you know, use Google for everything or feel like I couldn't ask for help. So that was the reason why I really wanted to learn the language. And I always believe you need a motivation to do something, otherwise, you know, if it's forced upon you, like you should learn the language, everyone was saying it, you know, it becomes something in the back of my head. Like I was thinking, you know, I can speak to you in English, I don't really need it. But yeah, it's always good to know the language if you're living in a foreign country, which is why I want to share these 7 tips which can help you if you're also trying to learn a language and not really motivated as much. So yeah, it can help you out. So tip number 1 is learn as many words as you can. Now I'm not going to be talking much about grammar until later on, just because when you're first starting out, I generally think it's important to know as many words as you can and then focusing on the grammar, just because just as when you were younger, when you learned how to speak your native language, you generally learnt more just by speaking and hearing the people around you, and that's the same method that I try to use when learning the language, which is speak as much as you can and remember the words as much as you can, so that way you can construct a sentence. Even though it won't be in the correct tense or grammar, the person you're trying to speak to at least will understand what you're trying to say, because to learn the grammar for any language can take take years to learn, and you're not going to be perfect, and it can be really frustrating and disheartening when you're just learning the grammar and you're trying to speak to someone and then you keep making mistakes because you just focused on that rather than just communicating. So that's why I don't suggest, focusing so much on the grammar, because especially for Slovene, which has so many different tenses for one word, that drove me mad when I was first learning it. I was like, for Go, there's like 5 different variations depending on who you're speaking to, the context, and etc. So I was like, this is getting annoying, and it would really put me off from learning the language. So that's what I would suggest: learn as many words as you can, and learn the words which you will find beneficial and that you need. For example, water, that's something that you need to know. That's a simple word, but you know how to say water, rather than learning how to say, I don't know, a bouncy ball. That's not going to be helpful for you. So if this is what I find, people around you do want to help you, so they tell you, this means that means this. But I generally forget the words because they're not something that I'm going to be using on a daily basis, and something that I need. So it just becomes a lot of pressure to remember all these words that I don't need. So it's a bit pointless, I find, when people are like, this means this, unless I ask you, what is this? Because then I know I need this, I need to know this word, and I'm more likely to remember it. So that is tip number 1. And one more point I want to mention on tip number 1 is learn your 5 W's, and obviously the how as well. I would highly suggest learn the formal ways of saying your what, where, when, who, and why, and how, of course. Learn the formal ways of asking these questions, just because it will save you a lot of trouble when you're trying to speak to someone outside and you're trying to switch between the formal and informal way of asking questions, or wanting an answer for something. And that way you can also be respectful when you're speaking to others other than your family. So I always recommend learning the formal way of asking questions. So for example, Kakosi is how are you, or you can say Kakosti, which is the more formal way of saying it, and that way you're also being respectful and you're using your manners. So obviously learn your please, thank you, excuse me as well. That's really important, so you don't be annoying foreigner who doesn't know how to use their manners. So that's another tip within a tip. So tip number 2 would be practice speaking as much as you can. Now, if you're lucky enough to have someone around you who speaks Slovene, then practice with them as much as you can. Try to ask them questions in Slovene and tell them to reply in a basic response, nothing too complicated. So that way you're also able to hear the response and get used to hearing a response for your questions, so you know what someone's asking you as well, if that made sense. But yeah, I also have somebody who doesn't speak English at all, which is great, because then I can practice asking small questions and see if they understand what I'm trying to say. So for example, my mother-in-law, she doesn't speak English at all, so then I practice asking her if I need something, like or if I can have something, like lako dobim, ali hochesh, like these sort of phrases I use with her, so then she knows what I'm trying to say. And then obviously I don't focus on the tenses of what I'm trying to say. Like if I want to say I want to go somewhere, like yaskrem or tigresh, are you going? So the short sentences, but the person understands what you're trying to say, and the more you practice, the more natural it will become to you. And also, if you get a chance to go out, obviously once this period is over, the quarantine isolation period is over, once you get a chance to go out, then try practicing saying the basics to the cashier, and also listen to their response, so that way you know what they're trying to say. It can be frustrating though, speaking to people who are outside, just because sometimes they just like to be annoying. For example, a little short story. I went to the store, the pet store, to get cat food, and my husband was with me, but I wanted to try to speak myself. So I said to the lady, oprostite, ki je maček hrana. Took me time to think about that. Prosím. So I asked, excuse me, where is the cat food, please? And the lady was like, huh? And I was like, and I said it again, and still she was like confused. And I was thinking, am I speaking French or something? Because I know maček and hrana means cat food, and ki is like where. So I was thinking those key points that I've, told her, those key words I've said to her, and she still doesn't understand what I'm saying. So I was like, oh my gosh. And then my husband came and he said something similar, probably something the same. And she was like, oh. And I said to my husband, I said the sentence to my husband, I go, do you know what I'm trying to say? And he goes, yeah, you're asking me where the cat food is. I was thinking, so why don't you understand, woman? Because it's so frustrating. I was like, oh my gosh. Anyways, it might have been my accent, but I've said it really slowly, to make sure I was trying to say what I needed to. Anyways, tip number 3 would be make a list. So this is more if you're going out. So when you're making a shopping list, I found it really helpful by writing the English version and the SLOVENE version of a list. Like, you can put the words next to each other, the translation for each word. And I found that really helpful. So when I went out, I would know what I'm looking for. And if I seen it in the store, I could find the product really easily. And that way it also became like muscle memory. I started to remember the words anyways. Like for garlic, I'd say it's chesen, onion, cebula. Like, I always remember my cooking ingredients because I love to cook, but it was an easier way for me to remember daily words and things that I need on a daily basis, just by having the list having the translated version. And eventually I'm able to now know the words without having a list translated for me. So that's a really good tip when you're going to buy food or anything outside, and that way you're not also struggling around the store thinking, where is this, where is that, and what does it mean. So yeah, that is tip number 3. So tip number 4 can be a bit annoying, and is obviously if you got the time, which is make sticky notes on things. So if you want to fill your house with sticky notes, that is up to you. But generally I put sticky notes on things that I use on a daily basis and things that I need. So for example, on my notebook, I would have a sticky note of a word, so I know what it means. A sticky note on the fridge, so I know what that means. So that way, it's like a fun way of you remembering the words, but that is optional. But that's another method I thought of. Playing online games. Now, I don't mean like computer games. I mean online language games, which I will include in the description down below. You can check them out. I'm not a sponsor or affiliate with them, but this is the way that I really love to learn. I like to play competitive games and learning games. So that for me is the most stimulating way of learning, is by playing competitive games and testing myself on the words and everything. So I do have notes, that's why I'm looking down. So online games, watching movies. I watched a SLOVENE movie called Kekit. Yep, I think that's how you pronounce it. Also another method would be reading children's books. So it's got the basic language and you're able to follow along the story. And if you don't know what a word is, then you can obviously Google it. But that way you can remember, you can read the book over and over again. So that way you know, understanding the words and what they mean. And it's a nice way, you know, to learn the language, because if you have children, you know, you can read it with them as well. So yeah, that's tip number 5 with 3 different methods of looking online. Okay, so tip number 6 is now when I would suggest to learn the grammar. So, once you're more confident speaking the language and you're remembering more words, then slowly you can start to learn the different tenses for each word, and that way it's not overwhelming, and you can focus then on the tenses rather than remembering the actual word. So for example, go, you know how to say go, and then you can learn like greva, gresh, grema, gremo, etc, etc, because there's so many, I think I forgot two. But yeah, that way you can start to add to your vocabulary. And one thing I want to mention is, don't be disheartened at the start when you start to practice learning the tenses, when you start speaking, just because you're going to make 101 mistakes. But unless you're planning to, write an article, that you don't need to be perfect. As long as the person generally understands what you're trying to say, then is great, because you're able to communicate, which is the main thing, and you start to understand what other people are saying around you, and your listening skills improve. So that is the main thing, rather than focusing on the grammar. Unless you want to be a professional and perfectionist, then go ahead and learn as much of the grammar as you want. Last but not least is the 7th tip, which is be consistent. The more you practice with anything, the better you will get. And I know it's easier to speak your native language, which is for me English, but try to incorporate the new language into your daily habits, and the more you do that, the natural it will become, and it will help you in the future when you want to travel around the country and things like that. You're able to communicate with different people and not feel as isolated as you would if you didn't know the language. So I hope these tips you will find helpful, and I hope there's a tip for everyone's different learning style, and I will see you guys in my next video. I hope you all keep safe, and bye for now.